Hi, I'm Szoke-Burke, a legal researcher at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. Welcome to this Google Hangout, which is all about community rights in the context of extractive industry projects. We've received a couple of questions today that look at impact assessments. So here I'm talking about environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments, but we can also think of this in terms of human rights impact assessments, other forms of health, or even spiritual impact assessments for certain Indigenous communities. The first question asks the following: I would like to know more about the weight a social or an environmental impact assessment carries in obtaining the green light for a mining project. The short answer to this is that it really depends on the local, the laws of the country in question and the policies of government ministries who approve any impact assessment as to the weight that it will have. Usually an impact assessment doesn't act as a veto. Government is usually, the domestic laws of a country usually establish that the government is the owner of the subsurface minerals that may exist, and also has the discretion to grant permits or enter into investor-state contracts that give permissions to specific investors to carry out a particular project. And this permitting or the contracting process can take place either before or after an impact assessment is conducted. Ideally, we would like to see feasibility studies, impact assessments, and other forms of due diligence and kind of baseline studies being conducted prior to the granting of permissions. But as you've seen in other stages of your MOOC, extractive industries planning is quite complex and has a lot of different stages. So it's always hard to determine exactly when a fully fledged impact assessment that can take a lot of time and cost a lot of money should take place in the decision-making around an investment project. But as I say, the government has the discretion to decide on whether or not to grant permissions for a project to proceed. And that discretion of the government will depend on evaluations of documents like this. In best case scenarios, there are some countries, in low-income countries in particular, who don't yet have the capacity or the resources to ensure that they are fully evaluating impact assessments prior to granting permissions. But this should definitely be the aim in such contexts. The next question asks, what are some benchmarks of impact assessments that determine the refusal of a license or right? Laws usually require that impact assessments be conducted, but they don't always set out exactly what impact assessments need to include or what impacts would make a project not worth proceeding with. Again, like I said, this is usually according to domestic law, this is usually a question that's at the discretion of the government, and the government is also obliged to meaningfully consult with impacted communities, or in certain contexts to obtain their free, prior and informed consent. So that's a kind of added layer that should come into the decision making here. Impact assessments from a practical standpoint, especially when an investor has not yet received permission, they would want the impact assessment to appear credible and to be based on genuine data and research, so that the government bureaucrat that is evaluating the impact assessment on the papers can read through the impact assessment, clearly identify what the likely impacts are in the way that the project is framed, and then see what the mitigatory measures or preventative measures that the company will employ as they are set out in that document. If the document is shoddy, then that's just going to increase the likelihood that the government will reject the impact assessment. And so that doesn't necessarily mean they'll reject the whole project, though. They might just send the impact assessment back to the company and ask for a better process to take place. And that could be due to shortcomings with community consultations around the project, or with how different environmental impacts or social impacts or human rights impacts are identified. The final question, or the final part of the question, asks, are there any particular examples where a company did not obtain a license or a right as a result of a impact assessment findings, or were required to implement certain preventative measures or readjustments? The answer is surely yes, but the details of these decisions are not always made public. So I don't have an example at hand, but definitely these impact assessments are a way for governments and other decision makers to have an insight into what the potential adverse impacts of a project are and how they can be addressed. A relevant or as pertinent question might be to ask, how can we make company commitments that are included in impact assessments enforceable in practice? One answer is that yes, governments can legislate to make the approval of impact assessments, to make the commitments that are included in an impact assessment conducted by a company legally mandatory or legally binding. Governments can also include these obligations in the investor-state contract, explaining that referring to an impact assessment and ensuring that the company in that contract undertakes to comply with all of the preventatory and mitigatory measures that the impact assessment sets out. And so the government therefore has an immediate legally enforceable mechanism of holding the company to account. For affected communities who are often excluded from these sorts of permitting and contracting decisions, that doesn't mean that communities can't also hold companies to account. There's a lot to be said for simply monitoring these, where you can actually gain access to an impact assessment and see the preventative and mitigatory measures that are set out. The community can then monitor the project to make sure that the company is actually complying with them, whether or not they're legally binding or not. Even better, where a community is seeking to enter into an agreement with the mining company, and that might be about land access or compensation or some sort of form of benefit sharing, the community can also try to include an obligation in the contract that gives the community legally enforceable rights against the company in the event that the company doesn't comply with the mitigatory measures that are contained in the impact assessment. So one example that I was involved in took place in an Indigenous context in Namibia. It was a mining project that was still in the exploratory drilling phase, and the community was negotiating a compensation agreement for that land access for the exploratory drilling. The community managed to negotiate with the company to carry out an environmental scoping, so something less comprehensive than a full impact assessment. And that environmental scoping report also contained mitigatory measures. The contract between the community and the company then included a clause that said that the company had to comply with all of the mitigatory measures included in that environmental scoping report. So in doing that, the community obtained legally enforceable rights to hold the company to its obligations. So these are some of the different ways that we can actually move beyond an impact assessment being, a nice policy paper, but not having so much weight in practice, to it being actually a source of legally enforceable rights, or the substance of legally enforceable rights that are contained in other documents. The trick then is to make sure that these sorts of impact assessment processes are actually even-handed and carried out by people who have the relevant expertise. So it's all well and good to have a contractually enforceable right against a company to comply with the mitigatory measures, but if the mitigatory measures themselves seem pretty haphazard or overly favourable to the company and not requiring a kind of robust policy to ensure that adverse environmental, social, or human rights impacts actually take place, then that might be indicative that we need to think about alternative models of impact assessments rather than just relying on impact assessments carried out by consultants who are paid by companies. There are a bunch of different models out there. Community-led human rights impact assessments are starting to take place around the world. There are also another model that I've been closely involved in is a new approach which looks to see companies and communities actually collaborate on a human rights impact assessment, so carry out the process together. This would involve, we kind of set out a process where there would be a steering committee as well as an impact assessment team with representatives from the community and the company, as well as experts and facilitators and other kind of project managers. So that the impact assessment not only is about researching and understanding what the impacts will be, but it's also about increased communication between the community and the company, increased information access for the community, but also increased opportunities for the community to contribute its perspective to decision-making around the particular project. We are now in the process of looking for pilots for this collaborative human rights impact assessment approach. It's not designed only for extractive contexts. Indeed, we are not necessarily wedded to it being in an extractives context, but it is an approach that we think will bridge some of the mistrust that exists between communities and companies around company-led impact assessment processes, and may also lead to, well, indeed is designed to lead to more robust prevention and mitigation measures that in the long run will lead to investment projects that have fewer adverse impacts on local communities and the environment. You can see more about that collaborative approach on CCSI's website, and I'd be happy to speak to anybody who would be interested in potentially piloting this model in the future.